In Canada, an occasion like this is begun with what we call a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement consists of thanking what we would call the First Nations people on whose traditional land we are conducting the conference, the lecture, the event of whatever kind. There's something fundamentally hollow about land acknowledgements because nobody's offering to pay rent on the land, much less give it back. But we acknowledge what we've taken. Canada has had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I recommend that to you. Most nations need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission because what is unreconciled festers. I want to make my own acknowledgement tonight, which is that coming back to the United States this time is difficult for a Canadian. It's difficult to come to a country whose president, in this morning's newspaper, continues to threaten the sovereignty of your own country, who treats your country as if it was a candidate for property acquisition. This is a cause of suffering. I know many of you don't agree with these policies. I know many of you feel blitzed and confused by what's happening. That's their strategy. It's not my place to tell you what you might do. It is very much my responsibility to tell you what it looks like from Canada to be the mouse in a cat and mouse game. It's not fun. Canada and the United States have been allies and friends for a century. What undid the relationship? Who undid the relationship? As our Prime Minister said, we didn't want this. It's on the US government. How you respond to it is yours. But I have to begin this lecture exhorting you to find a way to respond, because from where I am, your government is causing suffering. That's my acknowledgement. I have, in the course of a generously long career, been given the great gift of being able to question suffering for what is now 50 years. So I've had 50 years to question suffering, focusing on the context of illness, but trying to hear what different stories of sufferings have in common. Several years ago, I turned to Shakespeare because his stories are a veritable catalog of multiple sufferings. My scholastic disposition leads me to ask at this point what I have learned in all these years of studying suffering. But that question risks mistaking what suffering is. Suffering is not some objective reality about which researchers can generate what they call findings. Whatever I have found from listening to stories of suffering is the opposite of propositional statements that fix the meaning of some delimited thing, which is what findings are. Suffering is not a topic, it's a call addressed personally to you and to me. And what it calls for is a feeling that anticipates a response. Thus, we don't want or need a theory of suffering. The Shakespeare scholar Stephen Booth writes, "Theories of tragedy keep us from feeling tragedy itself. Theories of suffering risk keeping us from feeling suffering itself. And without that feeling, even well-intentioned and in some ways helpful responses to suffering strike a false note. What I have learned about suffering, expressed in terms that are radical in the sense of seeking what is at root, is nothing. But to immediately qualify that, the nothing that I have learned can be called Cordelia's nothing, referring to the opening scene of King Lear. Lear, in the play's first scene, commits what he intends to be the culminating act of his long reign. He will divide his kingdom between his 3 daughters. As Lear is about to declare this division, he surprises everyone, and maybe surprises himself, by delaying. He demands his daughters each tell him, before the assembled court, how much they love him. He frames this as a competition. Which of you, shall we say, doth love us most? The 2 eldest daughters compete in the unctuousness of their responses, each emphasizing how little words are able to express their love. Cordelia, the youngest, whom Lear calls our joy, listens and in an aside to the audience asks herself, what shall Cordelia speak? Her answer is, love and be silent. When Lear calls on her to take her turn in declaring her love for him, she says, nothing, my lord. Lear is incensed, banishes Cordelia, divides the kingdom between his eldest daughters, and the trouble begins. Cordelia's word, nothing, will reverberate like a drone note throughout the play. Lear repeats it in his dying words. Cordelia will be the faithful daughter who returns to defend her father from her sisters, whose capacity for cruelty and betrayal will be bottomless. Her actions prove her initial nothing to be not an absence of feeling, but rather an openness to possibilities. Her nothing expresses her refusal to set limits on what love might enable or require. Lear cannot understand this sense of nothing. Calling on Cordelia to reconsider what she has said, he asserts, nothing will come of nothing. The events that follow demonstrate the opposite. Anything can come of nothing. Cordelia's sisters are not wrong when they claim that words are inadequate to express their love of their father. But the irony is that they have little love to express. For Cordelia also, language is inadequate, but that is because she has too much to express. Eventually, only what she risks by responding to her father's need can express her love for him. A first lesson of Cordelia's nothing is that language cannot express what the suffering body feels to be overpowering it, emptying it, arresting it in a moment that is outside the flux or flow of time. A second lesson is that both love and suffering are shifting processes of dialogue, iterations of call and response. But suffering is also a sense of being closed off from dialogue. Just before I started writing this lecture, something happened that caused me a moment of suffering. In that moment, I felt utterly unable to call out and unable to believe that if I could call, there would be any response. Reflective thought, as internal dialogue, was almost but not quite entirely suspended. I retained just enough awareness to think, this is suffering. And the conventional metaphor felt true. We are plunged into suffering. Recalling that moment, as far as I, in this eminently comfortable moment, can recall it, I'm led to imagine a production of King Lear that is heavily influenced by the composer and poet John Cage. After Cordelia's "Nothing, my lord," the theater goes dark for some time, maybe 4 minutes and 33 seconds, in honor of Cage's most famous composition, in which the pianist simply sits at the keyboard in silence for that length of time. Cage wrote a poem called Lecture on Nothing that includes the lines, "We need not fear these silences. We may love them." In Cage's silences, we are pointed toward the sort of nothing that I have learned from suffering. Silence and nothing are not quite identical, but one often stands in for the other. I've just been told my battery is running low. If I don't make it through this talk, do you know something I don't know, little friend? We shall see. Some Shakespeare scholars account for Cordelia's nothing by observing that she is young and may never have been called upon to speak before the court. I don't understand Cordelia as intimidated. Rather, to me, and Shakespeare leaves it to each reader or audience member to fill in what he refuses to specify, Cordelia suffers from her recognition that her sisters are substituting appearance for reality. And if she speaks, she will herself become a participant in that disconnection. Many of Shakespeare's characters share this suffering, most notably Hamlet. When his mother, Gertrude, asks him at the beginning of the play why grief for his father's death, quote, seems so particular with thee, Hamlet replies, "Seems, madam? Nay, it is. I know not seems." Cordelia, like Hamlet, suffers from the world's seeming. Lear is demanding a performance of love, and such a seeming would for Cordelia be betrayal of the love that is. Better to remain silent than to seem. But silence is dangerous, and Cordelia's nothing is more a response to her own dilemma than it is a response to her father. This lecture is written in 4 chapters. Chapter 2, Richard sits upon the ground. A principal difficulty of silence is keeping it shared. Cordelia fails to make her silence shared. She cannot invite her father into her silence, and disaster will follow. Lear also suffers. As brute as his demand for expressions of love is, any decent psychotherapist would hear in that demand the call of someone who feels himself to be unloved. Cordelia's response falls short of the nothing that Cage has as pianist offer to the audience. The pianist's silence is not a withdrawal. It seems crucial that the performer remain present for the duration of the piece, performing the silence. Performing silent presence throughout prolonged silence must make 4 minutes and 33 seconds a difficult piece to perform. As I imagine the piece being performed at its best, The silence intensifies the co-presence of the one who acts by not acting and the others who are progressively drawn into that non-action. In their mutual co-presence, performer and audience exemplify Cordelia's love and be silent. For silence to be a nothing as possibility, it must hold people together as co-participants, not isolate them in their own thoughts, because these thoughts will readily turn them away from each other. Initially, silence offers a space to share feeling. It conveys recognition. At some point, however, silence needs to be filled so that it can become ongoing dialogue. In Shakespeare's tragedy of King Richard II, Richard responds to his own suffering by filling the silence with a call to tell stories. Richard has just returned from a military expedition to Ireland, and on landing in England, he receives a sequence of bad news. His cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, has returned from the exile to which Richard sent him and is gathering an army with the probable aim of deposing Richard. Richard's own army, believing he was dead because his return was delayed, has dispersed and gone home. And to close the circle, Richard's uncle, whom he had invested as ruler during his absence, has no troops to support Richard and seems to have gone over to Bolingbroke's side. Richard's situation reminds me of a medical scene in which a patient is told they have a fatal disease, that news immediately followed by explanations of why none of the possible treatments could help at their stage of disease. Richard's suffering has its immediate cause in his anticipation of being deposed, but beyond that is a fear that is not specific to kings. Richard suffers the threat of losing what has throughout his life given him his claim to be who he has believed himself to be. As his later speeches evoke in detail, Richard, being deposed from being king, is deposed from being Richard. He suffers the loss of what has been himself. Part of Richard's fascination for readers and audiences is his combination of brittleness and resilience. He begins the never complicated process of narrating himself back into being with a long speech that starts with a line worth remembering for when we ourselves are called upon to respond to suffering. That line is, "Of comfort, no man speak." Richard calls on his courtiers to stop holding on to possibilities that they should realize are no longer possible. He's lived his life on flattery. It's been his food, his sustenance. But from this point onward, he has no time for what he now recognizes as delusions. For all Richard's weaknesses and his capacity for evil, here Richard turns and confronts his suffering. He allows himself to feel it fully. Partway through Richard's speech come the lines that, if we have to speak out of suffering, show us how we might speak. And if I haven't crashed the system totally, this is where a slide should appear. But I think I've crashed it. So you'll just have to listen to me. Intimidating. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. How some have been deposed, some slain in war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court, and there the antic sits. I want to focus on the first line, Richard's "Let us sit upon the ground." He who has been accustomed to sitting on thrones now takes his place upon the ground with all the connotations of ground, including that in which his grave will be dug. If we imagine another production of Richard II, inspired by John Cage, in response to Richard's call, the actors would sit upon the stage, and we would have 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence. But, and here we get to the polyphonic possibility of suffering, Richard does not sit alone, and he does not call for silence. He calls for others to sit with him and to share the ground of suffering by telling stories of those whose suffering mirrors his own. Richard's proposal to tell stories makes explicit the multiplicity of voices that are at play in and around his voice, even though he alone seems to be speaking. Some of these are the voices of the kings who have died. Other voices are those who have told the stories of those deaths, including Shakespeare's own voice. And then there are the voices of those around Richard whom he proposes will join in the storytelling. Richard's suffering thus becomes a merging of voices, each of which, nevertheless, retains its singularity. My usage of this entirely too big word, polyphonic, follows the literary scholar Mikhail Bakhtin. I've written a great deal about Bakhtin and polyphony. And so here, let me offer only 2 short, but I think very significant quotations. First, Bakhtin understands polyphony as, I quote, a plurality of consciousnesses. A plurality of consciousnesses with equal rights, and each with its own world. With equal rights, and each with its own world. Combine, but are not merged in the unity of the event. Combine, but are not merged. Second, and elaborating that, Bakhtin writes that polyphony is, quote, an eternal harmony of unmerged voices, or as their unceasing and irreconcilable quarrel. The force of or in that statement, harmony or irreconcilable quarrel, is ambiguous. Does he mean or in the sense of mutual exclusion, or does he mean or that one? But I read Bakhtin calling on us to recognize that polyphony has 2 aspects, unmerged harmony and irreconcilable quarrel. In polyphonic suffering, harmony and quarrel depend upon each other. Each makes the other possible, and suffering comprises both, often at the same time. Suffering does not synthesize the harmony with the quarrel. There's no Hegelian elevation to a higher synthesis. Instead, suffering encompasses both, preserving each in its specificity. The tension of the play Richard II is between the harmony shared by these first cousins of the same age, Richard and Henry, and their irreconcilable, eventually lethal quarrel. The quarrel, initially about how far the prerogatives of kingship extend, and later about which of them should be king, curiously reaffirms the harmonic background of critical assumptions they both take for granted. Both assume the privileges of their shared blood, their nobility as grandsons of the great King Edward III, whose ghost sort of presides over the whole play. More subtly, they share existential expectations about how lives rise and fall. Bakhtin writes that in Polyphony, each has its own world, which is true, but at least part of that world, and generally a larger part than most of us can acknowledge, is shared with others. People feel suffering as their own, isolating them. Yet that isolation remains permeated with other voices, both physically present and immanently present. In Let Us Sit Upon the Ground and Tell Sad Stories of the Death of Kings, Richard recalls the voices that share his isolation. He turns his suffering into his story, which is both his own and merges into a corpus of similar stories. Richard refashions himself as a version of other kings who are manifested in his current circumstances. Thus, we can think of the self as polyphonic. Richard's identification with the stories of other kings can be recognized with equal validity as both a form of consolation and also what anchors Richard, what keeps him, what prevents him from escaping a narrative of predestined defeat, ensuring that he will continue to suffer. Recognizing that what consoles suffering can also perpetuate suffering complicates any claims for the therapeutic power of storytelling. It's easier for us to believe that what consoles and what perpetuates suffering are separate, with therapeutic effect being on the side of consolation. Eventually, we recognize, or should recognize, I think, how our sense of what counts as therapeutic too often reflects our fear of what suffering demands that we recognize. The demands of suffering begin with sharing, first silence, then story. When Cordelia was confronted with what her father, in his suffering, demands, she might have told a story. Perhaps a moment in her childhood when she felt truly loved by him and thus loved him fully in return. That would not have betrayed herself, it would not have been seeming, and it would have been a response Lear might have heard. What is at stake in this questioning of what we presuppose to be therapeutic leads to my most didactic argument in this lecture. I believe clinical thinking about suffering goes distinctly wrong when it situates suffering within the single individual, as clinical work routinely does, and then attempts to measure degrees of suffering, rather like a 1 through 10 pain scale. When professionals endeavor to calibrate suffering, which they do, they respond to the needs of institutions, not to the person who is suffering. Institutions require criteria for making discriminations in the care of patients who are processed bureaucratically as separate individuals. Institutional decision-making requires reducing complex lives to metrics, because metrics can be scaled. That's what metrics are. Metrics scale to produce an order of eligibility or priority. That's what they're good for. Understanding suffering as polyphonic interrupts and complicates how suffering can be invoked as a clinical or a judicial marker that enables institutional dispositions of individualized patients. Thinking of suffering as polyphonic thus slows down the rush of clinical institutional decisions. Much more could be said on this issue, but for today, let me get back to Shakespeare. Chapter 3, Suffering as Befindlichkeit, untranslated. To understand suffering as a call requires refusing the conventional academic and professional gesture of defining what I'm talking about. Definitions turn phenomena into objects. Definitions fix on a page what is thus fixed, fit to be gazed upon from a distance that is too far removed for shared feeling to be possible. The definitional attitude certainly has its uses, but when applied to suffering, definition separates the one who defines from what is defined. Thus, the one who observes suffering is not only separated from the one who suffers, but put in a hierarchical relation to the suffering person. Because to define is to exercise a form of power. Definition is power. Definitions induce forgetting that suffering is a consuming feeling, a sense of there being no air inside and no getting outside. Being in this airless space suspends language. This feeling immediately projects itself onto the world around it, shaping the suffering person's perceptions of whatever touches them. Sensitivity to pain thus increases. The irrationality of suffering is lost in any definition. Yet if suffering should not be defined, I do find it useful to ask how suffering can be imagined, because responses to suffering depend upon imaginations, whether in families or in clinics or within political boundaries. If suffering is imagined as internal to individuals, as a condition that is distinctly theirs, then responses seek to change that individual from a stance that remains outside of their suffering. I propose imagining suffering to be more like a place where people are, a location. Suffering is an aspect of being there. Responding to suffering begins with the responsive person finding their own stance in relation to that place, neither thinking that they can share it, that they can enter the place of suffering themselves, nor being wholly outside that place and its effects. My best choice for a word that expresses the mind-body effect of suffering abandons English for German. I propose describing suffering as a form of Befindlichkeit, which I had a slide for, but it's better not really, trust me. It's just Befindlichkeit, Befindlichkeit, just like it sounds. Martin Heidegger uses this word Befindlichkeit in Being and Time, although, as you'd expect, what he means is anything but clear. So I turn to the understanding of Befindlichkeit proposed with due caution that he himself may not understand it by the preeminent Heidegger scholar Hubert Dreyfus, who unfortunately died not that long ago. Dreyfus's gloss on Heidegger I find actually more useful in this case than Heidegger himself. Dreyfus begins by noting that Befindlichkeit is not an ordinary German word. Instead, it's a construction from an everyday greeting. Wie befinden Sie sich? Which literally is, how do you find yourself? Nice thing to say to people. It's kind of equivalent of like, how's it going? But it has this sense of place. Like, how do you find yourself? Dreyfus rejects translating Befindlichkeit as disposition because he says that makes it sound too outer. He also rejects calling it a mental state, as that would make it sound too inner. Dreyfus then proposes his own best approximation of how to understand this strange word. Out of desperation, that's what I love about Dreyfus, he'll admit it. Out of desperation, I then turn to an expression as strange as Heidegger's Befindlichkeit, namely, where you're atness. Dreyfus was a professor at Berkeley, and that has a distinct California. Where you're atness. What one needs is an English word that conveys being found in a situation where things and options already matter. Being found in a situation where things and options already matter. Since no word I know, this is Dreyfus's eye still, since no word I know conveys all this, I shall settle for affectedness, which at least captures our being already affected by things. That's the sense of this, our being already affected by things. I quote Dreyfus at length because he leads us to recognize several features of suffering, which if that quotation was just too much for you, I'll now give you my summary. First, suffering is not a what, but more like a where. Where someone finds themselves. Again, a sort of place. Earlier, I spoke of being plunged into suffering. Heidegger would say we are thrown into it. Suffering is where we are thrown. This place of suffering is neither inner nor outer, or it's both inner and outer. And language often fails to maintain that complex duality. Language relegates suffering to being either external impositions or inner interpretations or attitude. As a generalization, I would say that social scientists, when they study suffering, emphasize conditions that cause the suffering, the external, and clinicians treat suffering as an inner condition of individual patients. This place of suffering, both within us and outside us, is a way of being in the world. To be in such a place is both to take a stance there and have a stance imposed by being thrown there. It fits my understanding of suffering that Dreyfus describes as strange, Heidegger's construction of his almost newly coined word, Befindlichkeit. I want suffering to be a word that we always hear as strange, because acknowledging strangeness to me is crucial to sharing the feeling of suffering and to responding. Suffering's inner-outer duality is strange. We want things to be either inside or outside. To say they're both is weird. The polyphony of suffering is stranger still, rendering it neither yours nor mine, but somehow shared between us. How this sharing intertwines harmony and quarrel is strange. Definitions domesticate strangeness by proposing that meaning can be fixed. That's what a definition is. Thus, to define is a step toward making controllable. The suffering in Shakespeare's plays is unfixed. It's wild and dangerous because it is uncontrolled. Suffering roams across Shakespeare's stage. It's expressed in multiple voices and takes diverse forms as it shows up in different scenes. To use Dreyfus's self-consciously awkward but most useful phrase, suffering is when where you're atness is the penultimate worst place that you want to be, the very worst place being the imagined next place that this place seems to be leading you towards, that this place is the anteroom before. This worst place is all the more real in its fearfulness because it is only vaguely imagined. When Dreyfus writes that in Befindlichkeit things and options already matter, he implies a polyphony. In the place where you are thrown, multiple people's senses of what matters already matter. Their voices precede your arrival. What matters is never ours alone to decide, and what matters keeps changing. It too is mobile. By describing suffering with this comically complicated word, Befindlichkeit, I want to hold in the forefront of our thinking, from whatever position we think about suffering, that suffering is always and irrevocably a mess, both for those living a form of suffering and for those responding to them. I use this word mess in a quasi-technical sense, as it's been used by colleagues in science and technology studies, STS. A mess, as they talk about it, is a field of ethnographic observation, which might be a laboratory, for example, or it could be a hospital, or it could be a factory, in which so many actors are mutually affecting each other in so many ways that coherent description breaks down. There are just too many interaction effects for there to be a coherent description. That's a mess. Hospitals are a great example of messes. Both Richard II and Cordelia are thrown into messes that are partly inherited and partly their own fault. Richard, so long as he is acknowledged as king, is more empowered in how he responds. His call to sit upon the ground is a time out, a stop and recollect moment. Yet Richard is hardly less overwhelmed than Cordelia. He can't actually sit and tell those stories. It's not going to happen. Events are moving too fast, and Richard has to move with them. I understand that constant movement as another crucial aspect of suffering. Suffering does not allow someone to stop and take stock of where they're at. The present moment of suffering is suspended between a past that is no longer and future that is not yet. Past and future dislocate any sense of being present to the present. All this can be summarized by recognizing that a suffering person is unable to answer the everyday, perfectly polite question, how do you find yourself? That becomes an unanswerable question. To be suffering is not to be unable to find oneself, is to be unable to find oneself in the blur of what's happening. That again gets us back to the politics of the present moment. We suffer because we're in the blur of all that's happening, and that's how they can get us. Nor can the best intention to others find where the suffering person is. Those outside can't locate the suffering person either. Suffering keeps happening. That's pretty much its essence, which is a non-essence. It keeps happening in ways that are constantly complicating attempts to respond to it. Suffering is a mess that only gets messier until. But what eventually interrupts the moment of suffering is what those who suffer often fear the most. Chapter 4, Polyphonic suffering and claustrophobic suffering. Richard, I believe, shows the right instincts when he responds to his suffering by calling upon his courtiers to sit upon the ground, a position of humility, and share participation in sad stories. Consolation can be found in bringing in more voices. Yet suffering people often hear fewer voices, not more. Hamlet begins his soliloquy in Act 4 by saying, "How all occasions do inform against me." He expresses the claustrophobic isolation of suffering. Hamlet at that moment is about to board a ship to England, accompanied by Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, whom he now thoroughly mistrusts. Hamlet has no one left to talk to. Not that he ever had more than Horatio, in whom he could confide. That condition is both imposed upon Hamlet and it reflects who Hamlet is himself. Hamlet only rarely notices how other characters with whom he shares the stage also may be feeling that all occasions conspire against them. All occasions inform against Richard and Cordelia, but Shakespeare gives Richard more time to say more about how that feels. His circle contracts progressively as his courtiers are executed and his queen sent back to France, until he is alone with only the voices in his head. His final soliloquy begins, "I have been studying how I may compare this prison where I live unto the world. And because the world is populous." And so, excuse me. There we go. Sorry, I'll start that over again because I blew it. "I have been studying how I may compare this prison where I live unto the world. And because the world is populous, and here is not a creature but myself, I cannot do it." Polyphony has been reduced to monologue, which is a frequent trajectory of suffering. The consolation that Richard eventually offers himself deconstructs what might be consoling in order to reimagine himself as multiple selves, thus restoring a minimal form of polyphony. Richard says, "Thoughts tending to content flatter themselves that they are not the first of fortune's slaves, nor shall be the last. Like silly beggars who sit in the stocks, refuge their shame, that many have and others must sit there. And in this thought, they find a kind of ease. Thus play I in one person many people, and none contented. Sometimes I am king, sometimes am I king, and treasons then make me wish myself a beggar, and so I am. Then crushing penury persuades me I was better when a king. But whate'er I be, nor I nor any man that man but man is, with nothing shall be pleased till he be eased with being nothing." The last line brings us back to nothing. Richard will soon be assassinated. But if he dies in one sense, in dying he becomes another of the sad stories of the death of kings that will be retold in others' voices. Richard's death is not the play's ending. His assassin returns to Henry, King Henry IV, who had indicated, as obliquely as kings are able, that he wants Richard dead. The assassin expects a reward, but instead he is exiled, if not in England from this case, at least from the court and its favors. Shakespeare gives Henry's pronouncement of exile the weight of biblical allusion. With Cain go wander through the shades of night, and never show thy head by day nor light. But who is condemned to wander like Cain? The play that began with Richard exiling Henry ends with Henry exiling more, I think, than an assassin. I understand Henry is trying to make his own darker side disappear. In the later play, Henry IV, Part 1, those who joined Henry against Richard soon rebel against Henry, as Richard had predicted they would. In Part 2, Henry does die in bed as king, but not at peace with himself. It's a tortured death. In Henry V, the fourth play in the cycle, Richard's ghost hunts the son of his usurper. Suffering, Shakespeare shows us, has no beginning or end. It cycles. Most inescapably, when violence is its medium, suffering will continue to cycle. My message throughout has been that we cannot make suffering go away. And we should resist thinking based on a premise that we can. This is what I somewhat unfairly characterize as therapeutic attitude. But we can open spaces within suffering, letting ourselves breathe, one of my favorite metaphors. When Richard recognizes that he in one person is many people, he makes his place of suffering less claustrophobic by restoring some measure of polyphony in the only form that is still available to him. His multiple selves can talk to each other. Shakespeare shows us Richard's end, but not Cordelia's. I wonder if her last word might have been nothing, and on what ground she felt herself to be, that ground giving nothing its particular significance. Thank you for your great attention. I'm truly appreciative.
And thank you, Professor Frank, for that wonderful talk. We have a little time for questions. If you have a question, could you please raise your hand, and Avi and I will walk to where you are so that everyone can hear you through the mic.
Hey, you've been talking a lot about Shakespeare, but like kind of moving into more like legacies that Shakespeare might follow. Would you think that like choruses or more communal characters, you could call them, might be instances of polyphonic suffering? And could you see that being the case?
Yeah, and it might interest you. When I decided that I was just repeating myself as long as I talked about first-person narratives of illness, and I needed to broaden, I first of all turned to Greek tragedy, and I was going to work on that. And there were a lot of reasons why I didn't, the primary one being that I actually speak a version of English as Shakespeare does, and I don't speak Greek, and I realized that was kind of a boundary if I was going to do work even as serious as my amateur efforts are. And obviously, the chorus figures a lot bigger. You do get parts that have a chorus-like function in Shakespeare, and occasionally you get voices like Gower and Pericles that have a kind of chorus function. But Shakespeare doesn't really give you the kind of choruses. For that, you have to go back, and I think there you're exactly right. I mean, to me, my model of a chorus is actually an Antigone, where the chorus is really constantly telling Antigone that she's going too far, and that she needs to back off. That they're actually, Creon isn't just a total tyrant. He has kind of a point here, and she has kind of a point, and he has kind of a point, and that's what makes Antigone a great play. And that's what Shakespeare does carry forward, is that, yeah, Richard's really a rotten king, and the realm is better off deposing him, and you can never really depose a king. Like, that's just going to go badly. And there are no good choices. And that's what makes Shakespeare a fabulous venue for studying suffering, because that's what's endemic to suffering, is that there aren't really any good choices out of here. You just persevere. And in the tragedies, that's going to end with a lot of bodies on the stage. And in the late plays, which are a great relief for me to get to, things actually somehow manage to turn around, and it's okay in the end. But you hang right on the verge of tragedy beforehand. But I think you've said it as well as I can, that yeah, the chorus brings in yet another voice and serves to remind the audience how multi-sided this dialogue among different perspectives really is.
Thank you. Thank you.
Earlier, you mentioned Marshall McLuhan's "The Medium is the Message," and I think a theme in your work, as I see it, is this kind of de-emphasis on content and emphasis on process. I think, too, of the idea of defamiliarization, where art complicates and the object of the art becomes like the perception in itself, complicating again and again, like the suffering you mentioned. I guess I want to learn more about this idea of like form and content and the interplay there with suffering as you see it, the dynamic there. Yeah,
that's you've opened up a huge amount of material there. You're exactly right in the first part of your remarks. Part of my winding background, eclectic background, is I spent several years training as a family therapist, and just had a little bit of clinical practice, and then that ended because I got sick myself, and my trajectory changed. But at the time, particularly when I was training as in family therapy, the whole emphasis was don't get caught up in the content that the family is throwing at you, just all these endless details about their lives and what the designated patient, as it was called professionally, the family just wants to tell you all the terrible things this person has done that you're supposed to fix, and look instead at the process. You know, look at how people are telling, look at their affect, look at who's doing the most talking, look at who's silent. You know, pay attention to all those process aspects, and so yeah, you're right. And when I get to stories, of course, stories matter incredibly in their particularity, but I think the role of a scholar looking at a story is to point out the form that the story has to be cast in, and what it costs the person who's telling the story to have to use that form. Because there's very often, as the form imposes itself on what I don't have a good word for, but what we might call pre-narrative experience as it's felt prior to the narration of experience. The the narration is somehow false to that. I had this experience very much myself when I was writing my first book, my memoir of my illnesses at the will of the body, because I wanted to write this down. I needed, as I said about Richard, to write myself back into a kind of being. But I also felt that as the manuscript progressed, as I was lucky enough to find a publisher, and then it moved into editing, it was becoming more and more its own thing, and it was getting further and further from something that actually happened to me. I won't say I felt alienated from it, but I would say that as when I go back and read parts of it now, I read it as just kind of a book, not really as what I remember. Although just after I had written it, this may be useful for some of you who are doing clinical psychology, I was doing a lot of readings, and in some ways the book supplanted my memory. So I've gone through various phases with this. And that's what storytelling and suffering, I think, incur, is that you go through these stages of alienation, embracement, and then another form of distancing. And Cordelia's right. In telling the story, you're always substituting seeming, because that's what language does to us. You're also creating a possibility of dialogue. And in the dialogue, there can be a realization that silence won't get you to. So as much as I value silence and see it as a first level of response and recommend it as a first level of response to suffering, I don't think with Hamlet that the rest is silence. I think the rest, and Hamlet doesn't really believe it either. Because what's Hamlet say just before that? He's told Horatio to go out and tell his story. So actually, even for Hamlet, the rest isn't silence. The rest is the story being told by the good graces of Horatio. And that's the cyclical nature of this. You asked a really big question, and I'm conscious that I haven't addressed all of it in its detail. But that's at least a beginning of getting at the important concerns that you're raising.
I'm afraid we have to end there, but I want to remind you that we have books for sale in the Rotunda, and if you'd like to have your book signed, Professor Frank will, I hope, have a little time to sign here at the front of the room. Thank you all so much again for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much.